Welcome, everyone. We're pleased to be here and pleased that you're able to join us. We had a last-minute uh, cancellation with great regret from Julia Stash, and we are very fortunate to have brought in Valerie Chang, whom I will introduce in a moment. So thank you, Valerie, for stepping in with such little notice and such relatively little pressure being applied. My name is Tony Sheldon. I'm on the faculty at the Yale School of Management, and I'm the executive director of our program on social enterprise. I think I've been to, this is my 14th philanthropy conference over the years. And as many of you know, it is a student designed and run endeavor. There's an advisory board that I'm part of alumni who work mostly in philanthropy, but it really is the initiative of the students each year that frames the ideas and chooses the panel. And Ronald Zhang, who is in the background, but you will see in a little while, designed this panel, and we're very glad to have had his expertise and rigor in this. So we're going to explore this idea of a big bet. And I'm going to actually ask each of our panelists, when they introduce themselves, to describe what that term means to them, because it has different connotations and different meanings depending on your own institutional and background perspective. So I'm going to very briefly introduce each of our panelists and then turn to them with a question. So Harvey Dale is currently the university professor and director of the National Center on Philanthropy and the Law at NYU. Previously, he was the founding president of the Atlantic Philanthropies and president and CEO of the Atlantic Foundation. Valerie Chang is managing director of programs at the MacArthur Foundation, where she's had a number of roles over the years, including on their domestic grant making, and prior to that was with the Local Initiatives Support Corporation. Sam Gill is president and CEO of the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, and previously was senior vice president and chief program officer at the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. So each of you has engaged with this issue, I think, in different ways, and we look forward to hearing from you. Just a couple of logistical things for participants. There's a little tab in there for Q&A, and feel free to put your questions in there as we go along. We'll turn to them so we have at least the last 15 minutes to address them. And for our panelists, I would just say, please be concise so that we can hear as much as we can from each of you. I really want to hear you talk with each other, not just, talking heads responding to my questions. And just for sound clarity, if when you're not speaking, if you mute, I think that will be helpful. And the mute is like the little center microphone icon at the bottom of the screen. Great. So let's start with, how does your organization define the idea of big bets, and how do you approach them, and what's some of your rationale for that? So Valerie, can we start with you?
Absolutely. And thank you, everybody. As I mentioned to Tony today, that I'm sorry I'm not Julia, because you would have gotten a tremendous amount of expertise and experience from her, but she does send her regrets. And I did have a conversation with her so that I could at least help maybe share some of her perspective as well as my own. And I think I want to put that qualifier that people then put out, right? All mistakes and errors are my own if those are made. But Julie does send her best, and sorry that she can't join you today. So I've worked at the MacArthur Foundation for about 19 years now, and was part of the work that we did to think about what it would mean for us to be working in a mode that as Tony said, it incorporates big bets. But I feel like it is useful, as Tony's teed us up to do here, is to each define what big bet means, because I think the term is out there and it can mean a little bit different. It can mean different things to different institutions and different people. I think for MacArthur, the way we thought about big bet, our thinking about it was sort of thinking about what is the nature of the challenge here. And it does start from sort of what's a problem that we're trying to solve and what's a possible solution. But there were a number of questions that we asked ourselves about the big bet as we tried to define it. So, what was the problem or the opportunity? What was the goal? What was the challenge? What was the moment in time? What's the rationale? And sort of importantly, what could we at MacArthur do to make a contribution toward progress on that goal? So we also had our big bets be time limited in nature, where we thought about a reasonable time horizon for trying to make a contribution toward the big bet goal. And we were also going to sort of call the question if we didn't see progress or a line of sight toward the goals that we had set for ourselves. So for us, that was our way of thinking about and approaching big bets.
Thanks, Valerie. And we'll get into more details on that shortly. Sam, can I ask you, how do you think of the term big bet, and what's been your approach, both at Duke, but also at Knight Foundation?
Yeah, I mean, I would, there's sort of different answers. I mean, I personally have a somewhat different definition of a big bet than I think the ways that both Knight Foundation and the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation have thought about some of the elements of a big bet. I think in the main, I would really agree with Valerie that to me, what makes a big bet different than some other strategies of concentration are at least three criteria. The first is that you've got a goal. It can be quantifiable or qualifiable, but it's some threshold of impact, which Valerie articulated. The second, I think, is that you concentrate your resources in a way calibrated to the attainment of that goal. So you don't set a goal and then fund 25% of the way to it. What I think makes it a big bet is that you actually allocate resources that you plausibly believe will either in toto achieve that goal, or through whatever kind of plausible leverage you believe you'll be able to garner can achieve the goal. And then third, as Valerie said, I think is the time horizon. And I think those criteria to me distinguish a big bet from significant focus or persistence or concentration. A bet is a wager. A bet is an iteration in a game. And you can have many iterations in a game and win, but it's got to be some iteration. At the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, we've done some things that have had elements of that. We're in sort of the late stages of what we've called African Health Initiative, which is really trying to achieve some particular goals around supporting health systems in several African countries. That's had a time horizon associated with it. It's had concentration of resources associated with it. I think it's had goals over time. I don't know that the goals were clearly formulated at the beginning by design. It's not a criticism. I think by design, there was a feeling that something concrete could be achieved in the space that we approached, but I don't know it was formulated. In other areas, I think we've had sort of fewer elements. One of our signature efforts is the Doris Duke Artist Awards, which is one of the most significant awards for individual artists in the performing arts. That doesn't have a time horizon associated with it or a specific goal, but it very much has concentration around a kind of transformation. At Knight Foundation, the closest thing that we made to a big bet, so what you call a big bet, was a $300 million initiative around journalism that was focused on local journalism, and it was focused on really helping to build a field of study around the impact of the internet on information. And beginning to understand that in greater depth. We had a time horizon, we had significant concentration, but it wasn't quite a bet. It was actually about really an amount of resources that we felt could both challenge those two parts of the field to think creatively and ambitiously, could challenge ourselves to think creatively and ambitiously, and could attract momentum around these two foci of the future of journalism and information.
Great, thanks. Harvey, what are your perspectives?
I'm a
Sorry,
little bit
Harvey, you're on mute.
skeptical.
I can unmute you. Okay, we're good now.
Okay, I'm a little skeptical about our own Atlantic's definitions of this. We never really had a precise definition, and that's because I think it's almost impossible to get one. I'll give you just two examples. It's been suggested that one criterion to use in a big bet is that it's going to be time limited rather than an ongoing program. But of course, there's no precise definition of how long, and if the time limitation is 1,000 years, it doesn't create a very big distinction between that and anything else you're doing. And Sam has suggested, so I'm being a little critical of the criterion, Sam, that it has to be a problem where you can have a solution, a measurable result, and rather than it being simply incremental. But if you thought that your goal in some field was to get from 1 to 10 in due course, you could have it limited by saying, our goal for this big bet is to get from 1 to 1.5. And it looks then like you've met your goal, but so it depends on how you define the goal. You can always define the goal down in effect so that you can accomplish it. So I don't trust the criteria very much. What I think we did at Atlantic was treat it as one of the tools of grant making. So sometimes we were able to make a difference by grants that were modest. Maybe the organization was small but very powerful, and we would be willing to continue those as long as we thought the results were good. And occasionally we used a different technique or style for a particular grant. And the instances that come to my mind had a different criterion in connection with them, and that is it would lever the field, but lever the field in a particularly measurable way. So for example, when we started our programs in South Africa, the newly created constitutional court in South Africa was not fully funded. The justices were able to have each one clerk, but the burden that was on them was pretty heavy. The South African Constitution also explicitly permits affirmative action, and we were able to provide funding to the court in a reasonable lump that I thought was a big bet to get each of them a second clerk, and to have that clerk come from the historic majorities in South Africa, but the oppressed majorities, the blacks. And the condition on that was that the government would then pick it up. So it was time limited because it was a ratchet. We intended to do this for a period of time, following which the government would pick it up, and they did. And we did a similar thing with a larger grant in Ireland, setting up a program for research in third-level institutions which had not previously cooperated. And we put up a fair amount of money, again, on condition that once we finished that program, and it was to be a short time frame, the government would continue it. And that was in some sense a big bet, and in some sense it was time limited. But it wasn't intended to be time limited because the problem was solved. It was intended to be time limited because we were baiting a hook to catch a fish that would continue to be there after we left the field.
Thanks, Harvey. I think that's a great set of contrasts. I'm not sure you're actually disagreeing with each other, but yeah, I think one important way of noting it's a tool. It's not do so-called typical philanthropy or do big bets. There's a couple of groups like Net Impact that have chosen that as their strategy, but I think most are, it's a tool in the toolkit. And as you said, there's a concentration of resources. There's a significant, almost systemic level goal that you want to advance towards, whether it's 1 to 10 or 1 to 1.5, and that there's a clear time horizon of what you're trying to achieve. And depending on your criteria, that may be firmer or looser. So let me go back and try to press you a little bit more on, maybe you can give an example of a big bet that you have been involved in, or your foundation or institution has been involved in, and what do you see as sort of both key learnings and cautionary tales around what can we take away from these initiatives so that we do them better going forward? So I'll go back to Valerie to lead off on that.
Great, thank you. So our foundation right now, we currently have 4 big bets and what we call 2 enduring commitments. And I think this is a bit of a recognition that not every type of issue may be big bettable, or as big bet, as Tony said, that might not be the right approach to take for a particular set of issues. So for us, I think one of the, maybe to jump to the end from it, maybe one of the cautionary things or one of the things to think is that you might not want to put all your eggs in the big bet basket, right? It is a tool, it is an approach, and maybe not all topics or things lend themselves to that particular approach. Our current big bets are climate solutions, criminal justice reform in the United States, battling corruption in Nigeria, and nuclear challenges. And so I guess maybe just to one of the big bets that I work most closely with is our climate solutions program. And I think it is true that no single philanthropic effort could solve climate change. But at this point, we have a goal, which is to, the big goal out there is to sort of say, how do we take actions or develop a strategy that could help make a contribution to keeping the temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius that is scientifically the basis for what we need to avoid. And so again, we know we won't accomplish that in and of ourselves, but over a 10-year horizon, what strategies might we adopt to be able to understand whether or not we can make a contribution in some particular areas? And so, that I also think big bet philanthropy is also asking us to sort of evaluate what we're doing as we're doing it, to understand whether or not we're achieving those goals and where we might need to pivot. So ours is a 10-year climate solutions big bet, and midway through, around 5 years through, we had a strategy review that was just completed last year. And in that, we're sort of looking at what were some of the metrics that we were going to be following to understand whether or not our approaches and our grant making approaches were having the kind of impact that we wanted, and what might we do to adjust, and what might we give up. So one of the things when the strategy was first laid out had to do with a carbon tax and pricing carbon. And even though that's one of those approaches that felt like it could make a lot of sense, there's not necessarily been a lot of progress on implementing a carbon tax. So we thought it might be necessary to move away from that and then reevaluate the strategy and understand where we might make adjustments and adaptation along the way. So I think that's maybe one example of how we've implemented our big bet in our climate solutions area, continued to monitor our progress and work with our grantees, engage an evaluation and learning partner to understand what it is we think we want to know, and then how we're going to adjust our strategies along the way.
Great, thank you. Sam, your thoughts on, and again, an example if you have one, whether you're ideally your own or others that you're familiar with, and what are the lessons that we're learning?
I mean, maybe kind of to get into that, to kind of draw, I think, some philosophical issues that are being elevated here that I think are really important. Like, it feels to me that there's kind of 2 related questions on the table. One is a big bet an easily demarcated way of doing philanthropy that has attributes that commend it or don't? So to use your metaphor, is this a distinct tool in the toolbox, and when would you use it, and why would you use it, and is it useful to put it together? And I think that, I think you're hearing in this conversation some reasons to believe that you really can say a big bet is a hammer, and this other way of doing philanthropy is a screwdriver, and here's where you can use a hammer. And I think you're getting some good arguments as to why it just can never going to be that distinct. What sets a big bet apart from something else? I think a second question, though, that is underneath all of this is, are there different ways of doing this thing called philanthropy, and are some better than others? And so are there features of the thing that we're calling a big bet that can help to illuminate some of the really important choices we have to make about why to do the job this way as opposed to a different way? And I think, like, everyone in this industry should live with that existential anxiety. Like, most of the institutions represented, I know all the institutions represented on this call have really highly paid staffs to do a job that wealthy people largely did by themselves while they were alive. But I also think that with those really highly effective, well-paid expert staffs, we can do something different than maybe some of those wealthy people could do while they were alive, and that we hope is in line with the intent of those people for what their legacy would look like. To me, there's two really important features that I've heard articulated in the examples that Harvey and Valerie have given. So one is really thinking hard about not merely where can we do good, but is there some highest and best use of our resources, given what we're working on, who we are, what time horizon we're in, where the problem area is. So I think that's one interesting question: is there an optimization opportunity in philanthropy? And if there is, what are the ways that you make grants to optimize what their impact might be? And when I listen to Valerie talk about some of MacArthur's really interesting big bets, that's sort of what I hear is, so this is the way to solve an optimization problem in some of these spaces that we're in. I think a second and related issue that I'm hearing is, where can we be distinct? You know, there is nowhere that most institutional philanthropy is investing that other people aren't investing at all. We're investing sort of alongside and with other people who have other agendas, doing other things, often with very different amounts of capital or other kinds of material power and influence that they're bringing to bear. Is there something that we can do that others can't? Is there something we want to do that others don't want to do? And I think that's a really important question that anyone in any market should be asking themselves. What do I bring to this? What do I bring to this equation that other people might not be able to bring? It's not dispositive, but I think it's a really important question to ask. So, you know, to me, the cautionary tale that comes out of something we've done that I mentioned is the Doris Duke Artist Awards. You know, I think it would be to us that checks a lot of those boxes. You know, we are one of the few major national arts funders that is exclusively concerned with the performing arts, and exclusively concerned with the performing arts in three disciplines: jazz, contemporary dance, and theater. And so there's a good reason for us to think about, do we have a role in elevating the idea of the working artist through these three disciplines? I think it would be a mistake, very much to Harvey's good points, for us to say only over X years. At least to start, we could decide in the middle of that maybe we're not having the kind of impact that we want. I think also be a mistake for us to sort of over quantify or qualify that goal. In some of the spaces that we are grant makers, I think some of the goals that we could target are quantifiable or qualifiable. They can be well defined. In this space, we've got a general goal around elevating the idea of the artist. I think we should be disciplined over the course of our funding these awards to ask ourselves, is this really happening? But I think it would sort of be a mistake to say when we get to X artists, or when artists reach this level of stature in society. I mean, it's going to be so elusive that I think, to Harvey's point, the temptation will be to reduce it down to that which is achievable as opposed to that which is meaningful. And so, you know, that's an example where I think some of the elements of the big bet were crucial, I think, ingredients of how we think about what this can be and what it can do. But to cast it as a big bet, I think would have actually taken us kind of down the wrong path. So big bet's more of an inspirational frame in this context.
Great. Harvey, thoughts on that? And then I'll let Valerie pop back in as well. She's looking very pensive.
I say that I want to mention some things that are bad about big bets, but just emphasize the thought that you put forward, Tony, and that is that this isn't binary. It isn't as though there's small bets and big bets and nothing in the middle. And if you thought it was a grayscale, then somewhere in the middle there's a small big bet, and somewhere in the bottom there's a big small bet, and it's kind of fuzzy. And if you don't think about it as binary, you just think about using your best judgment about how to use resources at what size and over what period of time. And I think that's good. Let me tell you some bad news about big bets. One piece of bad news about a big bet is that if it is time limited and involves a lot of money, the risk is higher. But that's not terribly bad news, because no philanthropy is doing a good job if it does nothing does only riskless things. One of the jobs of philanthropy is to take risks. And the question is how many and how big. I think if you become completely content with yourself and never make a mistake, then you obviously are contributing to something where nobody has any need for your money. If you follow me, we used to have requirements that our program staff would submit recommendations to the committee, which would then go to the board. And I insisted that in each case for the recommended grant to be not only a reason for doing it, but a reason for not doing it. And it took a couple of months, but the staff began to understand what I meant by that, because sometimes they came in and they said, this program is so good that there are no downsides. And I would say if there were no downsides, they don't need our money, they're perfect. And we wouldn't make that grant. And forcing your program staff and yourself to think about the downside and the risk is really an important way of assessing the risk. So I'd say here are some downsides. One, it is the tendency of some folk, I don't want to mention any particular foundation or any governance body, to love big bets. One of our consultants called them BHAGs, big, hairy, audacious goals, BHAGs, because it gives you an adrenaline thrill and it makes you a little bit more arrogant. We're going to take on a task that no one has taken on before. We were going to cure poverty, right? Something like that. And if you get your heart beating fast enough, your mind stops working. And so one of the bad news things about big bets is they tend to get people all excited and adrenaline flowing and losing judgment. That's a bad bet. Here's another. I always thought that we had three assets inside our foundations. One was money, obvious. The second was accreditation, if you will. Our program staff over time had identified fields, scoped out the fields, and identified within the fields in which we were interested entities that were doing good work. That was a tremendous benefit. We knew that if we wanted to support activities in a specific field, we might have really among the best organizations that were inclined to be doing that. So that's what I would think of as accreditation. But the third thing we had was the most important, more important than the money and more important than the brass ring. And that was the learning curve that our own staff had, because any decision your staff makes today is just one decision. And if you make a big bet today, if you haven't exhausted your endowment, the amount of money you're going to be spending over the next years is bigger than that big bet. And that depends on the judgment and skill of your staff. And a real downside to big bets is they learn less. Our staff, me, learn less from big bets because they're very big and they're very time limited. And it's the same issue with trying to make endowment gifts. If you want to make a really big bet, here's a big bet. Find somebody you think is smart and give that person your entire portfolio. That's a really big bet. And that's the end of your philanthropy, because you're not going to learn anything more, and that's either going to pay off or not. I'd say that the three biggest risks for me in so-called big bets are the adrenaline flow leading to arrogance rather than good judgment over time, and the risk, which is somewhat higher, but I think that's an acceptable one. And the third is the diminution of staff learning, because the learning and capability of your staff is a bigger asset than your money.
Thanks, Harvey. Valerie, what do you think?
There's so much to say here. There's so much to respond to. It's such a great conversation. So I feel like I want to come back to a couple things that I heard Sam and Harvey point out. And I think, Sam's point that, traditional philanthropy, we're sort of in the middle of some ferment here, right? We do want to be rethinking the ways we think about processes and strategy and due diligence and evaluation. And there are increasingly an array of other models or ways of doing philanthropy. We can get critiqued for being separate and apart and removed, and thinking to Harvey's point that, we have to be careful about the arrogance or the hubris that comes with some of this, right? There are, the ability of any single actor to, be that big a player. I think we have to sort of be thinking about how limited we might be in our ability to really have impact on some of these changes that are out there. I do think that it's still possible to do learning in a big bet. I don't think we, are making bets and then walking away from them and saying what happens, happens. But I do think that it's true. I think our conversation points out that a big bet isn't necessarily the appropriate approach for all challenges or for all ways in which, as Sam said, we might want to find the highest and best uses for funds. I think, one of the things that I would say that I feel like we learned that what we wouldn't have done in a big bet is do some things that MacArthur's done historically called research networks, where we had some research networks that were bringing people together, not because we knew there was a problem to solve, but there were a bunch of questions to be asked, right? What is it about this particular field? And we have one in particular that I think was around work on our juvenile justice work, was very much informed by work that came out of a research network on adolescent development. And the research there subsequently has been cited in 4 Supreme Court decisions around, end of juvenile life without parole, juvenile death penalty. And it all came from the work that sort of bubbled out of these research networks, that adolescent brains were different, and that to hold them culpable in the same ways that we might adults was not a reasonable approach to thinking about justice or punitive measures or those types of things. So that would never have been a big bet. We're going to have 4 Supreme Court decisions to sort of change the trajectory of justice reform, juvenile justice, but it is some of the work that came out. So I do think that, to the point about what philanthropy can do that others can't do, we do have a little bit of the luxury of inquiry, right? We can do that. We can bring people together around a question, and that is, I feel like, a set of questions, and have them explore that. So that to me feels like a role that philanthropy has that maybe others don't. And in that learning, we were focused a lot in these research networks around bringing together different perspectives and diversity in the researchers, practitioners, policymakers. How do you approach a question or a set of questions from multiple perspectives?
Great. And that sort of weaves us into our next question. So I'll turn to Sam, and then we'll go around again. Are there particular issues or areas of impact where you think a big bet approach is more or less appropriate? Sam, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I mean, I think I want to respond to it in a way that I think brings in just like the remarkable reflections.
Please feel free to ignore me if there's something else you want to say.
No. It's I just organize my thoughts here. I mean, I think that so first of all, I think that's the right question, right? Which is not, hey, can we make a big bet? It's what impact are we trying to have, and is there something we're doing that would benefit from using some of these features and these attributes? And so I think the one thing you should do is look at your portfolio and say, where are there issues that would benefit from some of the kinds of tools that Valerie's pointing us to, and that are less vulnerable to some of the risks that Harvey's pointing us to. So I think a good example of that is if you've got an issue area in front of you where there really is something within your means that might be time limited, where there's where it's clear that what you're going for is 5 out of 10 and not 1.5, and that getting to 5 is somehow meaningful for the overall arc of the challenge, and the space that you're in and the expertise you have is well suited to make an investment or to make grants and learn from them as you go, that feels like a good candidate for a big bet. If the issue area you've got is that it's a really big problem in society and you're super excited to make your mark, then you're at risk for Harvey's risk number 1, that it's irrational exuberance that is carrying you into the big bet. And what you want to do is be an emotionally important investor in this. So I think actually Valerie and Harvey together are giving us like really good sort of silly characteristics that we can kind of use as we look at our issue areas. I think the second thing that I would say is, another thread in the last kind of couple of minutes of the conversation is what makes philanthropy distinct beyond the money, and which I think is a really important and under-asked question, because often we think of philanthropy as distinct for the reasons it's totally non-unique. Philanthropy is a capital allocator. Big whoop. Everybody is a big capital allocator than philanthropy. Philanthropy is purpose-driven. Okay, sure. Lots of corporations are purpose-driven, and government by definition is the most purpose-driven institution that we have. What philanthropy does have that some other people don't have, I think, are some of the attributes that Harvey and Valerie pointed to. I would sort of see as animating those attributes. One, independence. It's the most independent capital form that I think probably exists in the developed world. And it's more independent in the US than it is almost any. It's a very distinctly American capital form in many ways. This idea that private wealth aggregation directed toward private intents, but broadly oriented toward the public good, is a source of social progress, is a very like Tocquevillian federalist kind of idea, creative destruction of capitalism kind of idea. And I think the other thing that is really distinct to philanthropy is our partiality. At the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, we're not asking how do the arts trade off with social policy. Look, we care about the arts. We care about medical. Like we care about these things distinctly, and we're not trading them off with other issues. So I think the other thing I think that foundations can be thinking about when they ask themselves, is a big bet the right tool for us? Is how does our independence and our partiality locate us in this problem? And does it locate us in a way where, say, our leadership to say, hey, now is the time, for example, to target goal X? If that would be meaningful because of the way that we're located, then that might commend a big bet. And by contradistinction, if you're the standard bearer for an issue area through your independence and your partiality, that would actually argue against a big bet. That would suggest that actually you might want to think about having a differentiated portfolio because you're sort of the keeper of the flame for attention on this given issue. But I think the biggest takeaway I would say from just listening to everything that Valerie and Harvey have to say is, ask who you are and what you're trying to accomplish first, rather than how can I use this tool. And I think if you start with those things, you inject immediately a measure of sobriety into the conversation that can too easily be seeded.
Sobriety and hopefully humility as well. Harvey, other thoughts on this? What areas might be most appropriate or not appropriate, whether substantive or procedural?
Well, let me throw this out as a test case for Valerie and Sam. Suppose you each had a view that you wanted to tilt your portfolio towards bigger bets. And that's a tilt. And I'm using your phrase, Sam, portfolio, even though I am a little skeptical about whether charitable giving is really the same as capital investing. But I get the metaphor. We used it too sometimes. But if you wanted to do that, you wouldn't say we're going to take 10% of our assets and use them in specific big bets. You'd say we're going to spend all of our assets. We're not going to hang around forever. We're not going to be a perpetual philanthropy like Rockefeller or Carnegie or MacArthur. We're going to take all of our assets and spend them in bigger lumps over a shorter period of time. I can't remember who the quote comes from. I've always loved it, but I can't attribute it to whoever said that after he was sentenced to death that nothing focuses the mind than a hanging in the morning. If you decide that you're going to do your philanthropy over a limited period of time, it really focuses your mind. Atlantic, as you know, is the largest foundation ever to have a decision to be a limited life foundation. And that's a complicated decision. I happen to think it was a good one for us, but it may be of interest to you that one of my senior vice presidents, a dear friend who worked with me, I'd been a friend of his for 60 years, but he worked for me for 10 years as the head of U.S. programs, named Joel Fleischman. He teaches philanthropy at Duke, and he wrote a book on why that was a bad idea. And his most recent book is about the importance of staying around and not being limited life. I think there are perfectly good claims on both sides of that, just as if we were to take the portfolio metaphor, which I accept to a very limited extent, you wouldn't want to have all of your assets in one security. You want to have some diversification. If you wanted to have a really big bet, you'd pick your bet and you'd do it. But as Jack Bogle, who is the now deceased head of Vanguard, used to say, if you're an investor, don't look for the needle in the haystack, buy the haystack. I love that quote. I think it's good for philanthropy to be comfortable with incremental change in most of its programs. And the reason for that is that most of society's problems are not brand new. And if the society's problems are not brand new and they were around 100 years ago, you've only got, it seems to me, three things to say. One is, everybody before me was evil, so now I'm good and I can fix it. Or everybody before me was stupid and now I'm smart and I can fix it. Or I don't care, I just want to do something big. But if most of society's problems that linger are hard to solve, then it seems to me it's perfectly good to say our goal is to make things better. And being incremental is not bad, and it does have no particular risk of arrogance.
Thanks, Harvey. So we could talk about this for hours and have a great time, but I'm mindful of our time, and we do want to have time for questions as well. So where do you see the philanthropic sector heading, either, or maybe both, within your own institution and more broadly? Do you anticipate to see more and more of these, relatively speaking, large bets to try to make, systemic rather than incremental change? What's your view on the prevalence of these kinds of approaches going forward? And why don't we just vary it a little bit and start with Sam?
I think our institution, where the sector might go, obviously could be two different things. I mean, I would say my fear is, that a lot of the, like every trend in any sector, that a lot of the adherents of what we're calling big bet philanthropy aren't doing the thinking, the organic thinking that MacArthur did to get to its strategy. And I don't know that, and I think there will be waves, as there always are waves of popular ways, popular new ideas about how to do something useful with this capital that are trumpeted as the only way to do it, or the best way to do it. And people will say that for a period of time, then it will kind of recede, and people who are good at using the tool will keep using it, and people will move on to whatever the next tool is. I think, to Harvey's point, certainly what I think would be a shame is if philanthropy gets out of the business of trying to take on, manageable pieces of really complex social problems, on the grounds that they can't claim credit for solving the issue. And, MacArthur has the important stature of being one of the very largest foundations, and so can operate at a scale, that is very different from the long tail of most of the independent philanthropic capital in the country, including us. I think that at the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, we're trying to think about these questions in the fundamental way that they've been raised here. So I think there are some spaces, to use the portfolio metaphor, where I think we could be further out in the risk spectrum than we are in terms of, how we're making grants and what those grants are trying to achieve, and taking on a greater chance of failure. And the great thing about risk is it can be described. You can know the level of risk that you're taking on, and then seek returns that you think are commensurate with that, social returns that you think are commensurate with that. So I think there's some areas where we're really thinking about a greater level of concentration. I think another thing that we're thinking about is, we were one of the foundations that also, with MacArthur and with some others, who borrowed against our endowment during COVID, during a very, I think, different understanding of what the pandemic was and would be. And, one of our big takeaways from that is there is a kind of laziness in this field where you just sort of say, you take something like 5% or a little bit over, and that's what you're allowed to spend on grants. And the truth is that, that you should always be asking of your capital, how can I put it to work in a really effective way? And one of the really interesting features of the moment, when a number of foundations borrowed against their endowments, is how low interest rates were. And the truth is, it wasn't actually taking a really big risk with the capital from a financial perspective to borrow in that moment. Actually, sort of protecting your principal and deferring to the maturity of the bond, given what returns have looked like over the last couple of years, you could argue was actually a better way to grow the real purchasing power, or at least to maintain the real purchasing power of your endowment. What we're trying to take out of that is, can we just be more thoughtful about the different ways to put our assets, whether they're capital or intangible, to work, and to really see them as things that need to go out and earn impact in the world. And when I say tangible and intangible, I mean everything. We own and operate 2 centers. And as Harvey said, one of your biggest assets is your people, and what they know and what they can do and how they can participate in the field. And coming up with really good ideas for grant making is one of the great things these people can do. But in a highly interconnected, interdependent age, there's a ton of great things that really smart, dedicated people can do to drive impact forward. And that, by the way, is something that, one really wealthy person alone, or with one person guiding their philanthropy, can't do. They can't go be active participants in all of these different fields. So thinking about that as a responsibility and an opportunity is something that we're also, there's been a part of our critical discussions.
Thanks, Sam. We're running a little bit into Q&A, but we only just have a couple questions I think we can get to. So Harvey, if you would comment on this idea of where you see the trends moving, and then we'll let Valerie have the last word, which seems only appropriate.
Well, I think I can be brief on this. I ran Atlantic for 20 years, which is probably too long, but I stepped down in 2021. I stayed on, I'm sorry, 2001, and I stayed on for another, I think, nearly 10 years on the board of directors. But it's been a long time since I had my daily conversations and lunches with other people who were running foundations. So I think I might have touched on that, and I don't think I could make a good prediction about which way it's going to go. I can keep my fingers crossed that people will treat it as a matter of style and not as a binary choice.
It's probably a good sign if the director of the National Center on Philanthropy is agnostic on this. Valerie, you know, MacArthur is maybe most known among foundations for vigorously pursuing this in the strategic ways. What do you see as the trends?
Well, you know, I really just do appreciate the conversation we've had today and the multiple perspectives that Sam and Harvey have also shared. I do think, right, one of the things as we think about where's philanthropy going, what's it going to look like going forward for all of us, especially in established philanthropy, to sort of step back a little and reflect on what it is. Sam said, what do we think we know? What do we think we're supposed to be doing? How would you sort of put that, you know, ask that question, interrogate that consistently? I also think that, you know, there are new types of philanthropists, people with wealth, who are thinking differently about how they want to act and engage and give away their money, right? We have examples more recently, right? Mackenzie Scott's way of giving is really sort of shaking up the way in which philanthropy ought to be thinking about how you do things. She is making a big bet of sorts, which is on civil society organizations close to the ground that have been doing the work day in, day out for years, decades, and not necessarily been recognized by traditional philanthropy, or not given the freedom to say, here's a general operating support grant, go do what you do best. So I think there's new models for philanthropy. I think one of the things philanthropy really does need to do, and we're wrestling with this in our institution, is think about, again, the power dynamic. How can we be more thoughtful and creative about how we engage with communities, with those that the resources we're providing are meant to help support their work. As Sam mentioned, we did, as Doris Duke did, raised bond funds and then put that out through a much more participatory process where we engaged external advisors and had them help us think about developing the strategy and setting the strategic direction as we seeded our own power. So I think all of that is also coming into play for philanthropy as we look forward.
Great, thanks. And there was a panel earlier today on just that issue of community participation and voice of the so-called beneficiaries in the allocation of resources. Ronald, do you want to pop in with questions? And if you haven't posed question and you've got a question, please feel free to post it in the Q&A, which is on the right-hand side of the sidebar.
For sure. Big thanks to the panel for a really insightful discussion, and thanks to Tony for the great moderation as well. I might actually jump in sort of on that last point that Valerie was touching on around bringing that external voice in and that community voice in. We've got an anonymous question in the thread around how scaled funding approaches often rely upon external consultants or external NGO input for their design. And so there's a question around why there isn't more years-long funding models that we see for NGO-led research and development, and the creation of totally new NGOs where there are gaps that exist in that market to fill those needs.
Would anybody like to take that one on? Valerie, I feel like in some ways you got at that, and Sam to some degree as well, on your research networks, and Sam on the ongoing program of funding artists. But Sam, you unmuted yourself, so take it away.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, look, to me, there's two really important things that I think about in terms of, and look, these could be rent-seeking views, but that I think about in terms of our role at Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. The first is, this is somebody else's money. I think that's really important to remember. Our board isn't independent directors. It's not equity stockholders. It's trustees of private wealth. And well, absolutely, our piety should be to serve those who we're making grants to, who we're funding, to lead their work and to drive their work according to how they think that it should be done. And of course, we are investing in or betting on or funding some other organization's sort of genius and animating idea. The reality is an organization that's not us does not have any obligation to Doris Duke and her intents. And so that is one argument for why there needs to be a professional staff whose obligation is to Doris Duke, unless what she said was, hey, this should just go to the field. And as Valerie pointed out, Mackenzie Scott's doing it differently because it's Mackenzie Scott's money. And Mackenzie Scott can say, you do whatever you want. That's my intent, is that you do whatever you want. We've got to work with what we were left with by Doris Duke. The second argument that I also think is more sustainable than it sometimes gets credit is that there's one job, which is driving your best idea, and there's another job, which is taking a view of the whole field. And I don't think philanthropy is the grantee graduated. I don't think philanthropy is alienated from the grantee. I think philanthropy is a different job, which is to say, here's a big challenge or problem, we use a lot of words, or opportunity. And there's lots of different things that are going on that could contribute to that. Some of those things have an intentionality toward that challenge or opportunity. Some are targeting some other thing, but we think actually funding it will help to ameliorate this condition or advance this good or whatever. That to me is a different kind of job. And so, again, it comes back to, I just see that as our obligation. How can we make sure that what we're not doing is second guessing? So look, if we're that smart, we'd be the grantee. So the goal is not to second guess an NGO, but it's to do a different kind of job with relation to a social problem or social challenge that absolutely has to be led by and driven by hearing what's going on in the field. The best program officers that I ever worked with are NGO-led, in the sense that they're just bringing information into the foundation, and then we're using a set of criteria to try to make sense of that information and be a responsible participant in the broader civil society.
Thanks, Sam. Valerie or Harvey, if you'd like to respond to those, we've got a couple other questions as well.
Great, I can jump in with the next one. Just around I think there was an earlier panel around the relationship between philanthropy and democratic process, and whether this idea of putting private capital to public purposes is an inherently anti-democratic one. And so the question is put, what is the risk that philanthropies run with big bets in imposing a particular view of what the future should look like upon society without that accountability?
Harvey, this sounds like it was made for you.
There's a column today in the New York Times by David Brooks, one of my favorites, and he pointed out that democracy is a very hard thing to run, and it's worth reading his column on that. But in order to get the democracy we have and want, it was essential that the Bill of Rights also be adopted. And the Bill of Rights is intrinsically counter-majoritarian. The very purpose of the Bill of Rights is to make sure that people who have unpopular ideas may speak, people who believe in unpopular religions may practice. The state has limitations, and individuals are positioned so they can do what they want to do. It is powerfully important that the goal of the independent sector is not efficiency, it's cacophony. The major goal of the independent sector is to make sure that voices are heard. And it's perfectly okay for a charity to spend its money within the limits of lobbying to encourage people to be pro-choice, while another foundation encourages people to be pro-life. And we do not net out those two voices. We allow them to be heard. And I do not think that, first of all, it's not even technically possible, but I do not think it would be a good idea to say that philanthropy would have to depend on a vote of the majority. a lot of really important initiatives. Certainly, I could think of many in which Atlantic was engaged, but I know Valerie and Sam could do the same. A lot of the initiatives that are very important to their philanthropies would not get a majority vote of the population or of the people in their city. It doesn't matter. And if you wanted to say that the majority controls, then you better be prepared to say that that's true even for people who haven't given their money to charity. The answer to that is sometimes, well, after all, once you've given it to charity, you've gotten a tax deduction. And if anybody wants to look at this, the wealthiest people in our society who have given money away have gotten essentially no tax deduction. Warren Buffett has disclosed that for every dollar that he gives to charity, he gets a deduction of less than 1 penny. Less than 1 penny. In fact, he gets a deduction of 12 1/100ths of 1 penny for every dollar he gives away, because that's the way the tax code is written. I could teach that too, but this probably isn't the right time, Tony, nor is this a law school class. But that argument just doesn't work. Would we be happy having a rule that says that no individual can spend more than a certain amount of money on his or her points of view? That issue went to the Supreme Court, and that's Buckley against Vallejo. And the Supreme Court said that limiting what an individual may spend to voice his or her own concerns is unconstitutional under the First Amendment. If we want to maintain the right of everybody to speak, we do not do that because what everybody wants to speak is what the majority believes.
Thanks, Harvey. Valerie, thoughts on that one of the risk of philanthropies, particularly with big bets, moving away from a sense of accountability and engagement with the broader society?
I don't know. Like I feel like, we have, as Harvey and Sam have said, right? We have these philanthropy is a vehicle. It is there is a tax purpose here behind it, but there is, this is also a vehicle to make contributions for the social good. And I don't know that, I don't think that any individual actor, really can wield that much influence. I think we're one part of a big piece of things trying to make progress or trying to contribute toward progress to some of these big societal goals.
I mean, Jim, if I could weigh in on this too. I mean, I think that Harvey made a really important point. Absolutely, I think it's fair to ask, where as a society are we comfortable or uncomfortable with sources of influence or power that don't have public accountability built into them? That's an important question to ask, and that you have to ask about every sector that's not government. But there's something else, which is the animating idea of philanthropy is highly democratic in the American sense, as Harvey's noted, which is it's incredibly anti-statist. Again, this idea that there should be private wealth aggregation guided by private intents, that's a source of social progress, is a very anti-statist idea, that part of our democratic system is not merely public accountability and collective decision making, but liberty. So what I do think, though, that we are in a moment, I think, where in very specific areas, people are asking questions about the way in which private capital influences things like elections. And so, my favorite view of this critique, because I think it's a more powerful critique, is to be just much more specific about it. And to say, here are the places where we really aren't comfortable with capital that isn't publicly accountable, either for philosophical reasons or just for emergent reasons. I think there's a good dialogue to be had building on what Harvey said, which is to say, has something changed about the concentration in wealth in America since Buckley v. Vallejo? That is a much more specific, to me, and productive conversation than the fact that not publicly accountable amounts of money that are frankly relatively de minimis against most public expenditures, whether that's intrinsically anti-democratic. And that specific discussion, I have to say, I have never met anyone in philanthropy who wouldn't entertain that discussion around specific areas of giving. And I hope that that's true, but it certainly has been my anecdotal experience.
So I think on that note, we're going to have to conclude our discussion and conclude the Yale Philanthropy Conference. I think we're the last panel, and I think it's a fitting place to wrap up of looking at those broader issues and valuing broad consensus and specialized dissent, and the ways in which philanthropy does that, and the big bet approach is one among many pieces in the toolbox. So thank you very much to Valerie, Sam, and Harvey for joining us. Thank you to Ronald for pulling this together. Huge thank yous to the broader organizing committee of the Yale Philanthropy Conference, and especially Michael Berger. So unless there's some power that be would like to say something more, I think we'll wrap it up here. Michael, I don't know if you're out there. If so, feel free to pop in and say hello.
Well, also thank you, Tony.
My pleasure.